Chapter 12 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 12, 1551 to 1552. An Anxious Tutor. Somerset's Final Fall. The Charges Against Him. His Guilt or Innocence. His Trial and Condemnation. The King's Indifference. Christmas at Greenwich. The Duke's Execution. Aylmer had been so far encouraged by the success of his appeal to Henry Bullinger on behalf of his pupil that he is found, some 7 months later, calling the Swiss churchman again into council. He was possibly over-anxious, but the tone of his communication makes it clear that Lady Jane Grey had been once more causing her tutor disquiet. Responding, in the first place, to Bullinger's congratulations upon his privilege in acting as teacher to so excellent a scholar, and in a family so well disposed to learning and religion, he proceeds to request that his correspondent will, in his next letter, instruct Lady Jane as to the proper degree of embellishment and adornment of the person becoming in young women professing godliness. The tutor is plainly uneasy on this subject, and it is to be feared that Jane had been developing an undue love of dress. Yet the example of the Princess Elizabeth might be fitly adduced, observes Aylmer, furnishing the monitor with arguments of which he might, if he pleased, make use. She at least went clad in every respect as became a young maiden, and yet no one was induced by the example of a lady in so much gospel light to lay aside, much less look down upon, gold, jewels, and braidings of the hair. Preachers might declaim, but no one amended her life. Moreover, and as a less important matter, Aylmer desires Bullinger to prescribe the amount of time to be devoted to music. If he would handle these points at some length, there would probably be some accession to the ranks of virtue. One would imagine that it argued ignorance of human nature on the part of Lady Jane's instructor, to believe that the admonitions of an old man at a distance would have more effect than those of a young man close at hand. Nor does it appear whether or not Bullinger sent the advice for which Aylmer asked, but that his pupil's incipient leaning towards worldly vanities was successfully checked would appear from her reply, reported by himself, when a costly dress had been presented to her by her cousin Mary. It were a shame, she is said to have answered, in rejecting the gift, to follow my Lady Mary, who leaveth God's word, and leave my Lady Elizabeth, who followeth God's word. It might have been well for Jane had she practised greater courtesy towards a cousin at this time out of favour at court, but no considerations of policy or of good breeding could be expected to influence a zealot of 15, and Mary, more than double her age, may well have listened with a smile. When Aylmer's letter was written, the Grey family had left Bradgate and were in London. The Marquis had, some 2 months earlier, been advanced to the rank of Duke of Suffolk, upon the title becoming extinct through the death of his wife's 2 half-brothers, and the tutor may have had just cause for disquietude lest the world should make good its claims upon the little soul he was so carefully tending. In November 1551, Mary of Lorraine, Queen Dowager of Scotland, had applied for leave to pass through England on her way north. It had not only been granted, but she had been accorded a magnificent reception, Lady Jane, with her mother, taking part in the ceremony when the royal guest visited the king at Whitehall. 2 days later she was amongst the ladies assembled to do the Queen honour at her departure for Scotland. It may be that this participation in the pomp and splendour of court life had produced a tendency in John Aylmer's charge to bestow overmuch attention upon worldly matters, nor can it be doubted that his heart was sore at the contrast she had presented to Elizabeth, whose plainness of dress, he says, still commending the princess, was especially noticed on the occasion of the visit of the Queen Dowager of Scotland. Perhaps, too, the master looked back with regret to the quiet days of uninterrupted study. The Dorset household, when not in London itself, were now to be chiefly resident at Sheen, within reach of the court. Jane, too, was growing up. Aylmer was young, and to the gentle schoolmaster the training of Lord Dorset's eldest daughter may have had an interest not wholly confined to scholarship or to theology. It is nevertheless impossible to put back the clock, and the days when his pupil could be expected to devote herself exclusively to her studies were irrevocably past. Meantime, the hollow treaty of amity between the two great competitors for supremacy in the realm was to end. In the spring of 1551, Somerset and Warwick were on terms of outward cordiality, and a marriage between the Duke's daughter and the eldest son of his rival, which took place with much magnificence in the presence of the King, might have been expected to cement their friendship. But by October, carry-tales and flatterers, says one chronicler, had rendered harmony, even the semblance of harmony, impossible. Or, as was more probable, Warwick, suspicious of the intention on the part of the Duke of regaining the direction of affairs, had determined to free himself once for all from the rivalry of the King's uncle. Somerset had again been lodged in the Tower, to leave it this time only for the scaffold. On the question of his innocence or guilt there has been much discussion amongst historians, nor is it possible to enter at length into the question. The crimes of which he stood accused were of the blackest dye. The good Duke, as the people still loved to call him, was charged with plotting to gain possession of the King's person, of contriving the murder of Warwick, now to be created Duke of Northumberland, of Northampton and Herbert, and was to be tried for treason and felony. Many and various are the views taken as to the guilt of the late Protector. Mr. Tytler, most conscientious of historians, after a careful comparison of contemporary evidence, has decided in his favour. Others have come to a different conclusion. The balance of opinion appears to be on his side. His bearing throughout the previous summer had been that of an innocent man, who had nothing to fear from justice. But justice was hard to come by. His enemy was strong and relentless, a competent lawyer, known soldier, able statesman, and in each of these capacities he was seeking to bring a dangerous competitor to ruin. It was, says Fuller, almost like a struggle between a naked and an armed man. Yet, open-hearted and free from distrust, as he is described, Somerset must have been aware of some part of his danger. His friends amongst the upper classes had ever been few and cold. The reformers, for whom he had done so much, had begun to indulge doubts of his zeal. Become possibly weary of persecution, he had tried to make a way for Gardiner to leave the prison in which he was languishing, and alone of the council had been in favour of permitting to Mary the exercise of her religion. These facts were sufficient, in the eyes of many, to justify the assertion made by Burgoyne to Calvin that he had grown lukewarm, and had scarcely anything less at heart than religion. He was naturally the last to hear of the intrigues against him, and of the accusations brought in his absence from the council chamber. An attempt, it is true, was made to warn him by Lord Chancellor Rich, by means of a letter containing an account of the proceedings which had taken place, but carelessly addressed only to the Duke, it was delivered, by a blunder of the Chancellor's servant, to Norfolk, Somerset's enemy. Surprised at the speedy return of his messenger, Rich inquired where he had found the Duke. "In the Charter House," was the reply, on the same token that he read it at the window and smiled thereat. But the Lord Rich, adds Fuller, in telling the story, smiled not, resigning his post on the following day, on the plea of old age and a desire to gain leisure to attend to his devotions, and thereby escaping the dismissal which would have resulted from a betrayal of the secrets of the council. By October 14, the Duke was cognizant to some extent of the mischief that was afoot, for it is stated in the King's Journal that he sent for the Secretary Cecil to tell him that he suspected some ill. Mr. Cecil answered that, if he were not guilty, he might be of good courage. If he were, he had nothing to say but to lament him. It was not an encouraging reply to an appeal for sympathy and support, and must have been an earnest of the attitude likely to be adopted towards the Duke by the rest of his colleagues. 2 days later, Edward's Journal notes his apprehension. The issue of the struggle was nevertheless uncertain. In spite of his unpopularity amongst the nobles, and though, to judge by the entries in the royal diary, the course of events was followed by his nephew with cold indifference, Somerset was not without his partisans. Constant to their old affection, the attack upon him was watched by the common people with breathless interest, accentuated by the detestation universally felt for the man who had planned his destruction. Hatred for Northumberland joined hands with love for Somerset to range them on his side. The political atmosphere was charged with excitement. Could it be true that the good Duke had designed the murder of his rival, who, whatever might be thought of him in other respects, was one of the chief props of Protestantism? Had the King, as some alleged, been in danger? The trial would show, and when it became known that the prisoner had been acquitted of treason, and the axe was, therefore, according to custom, carried out of court, his cause was considered to be won. A cry arose that the innocence of the popular favourite had been established, and the applause of the crowd testified to their rejoicing. It had been premature. Acquitted of the principal offence with which he stood charged, he was found guilty of felony and sentenced to death. The verdict was received with ominous murmurs, and in a letter to Bullinger, Ulmus states that, observing the grave and sorrowful aspect of the audience, the Duke of Northumberland was wary enough to take his cue from it, and to attempt to propitiate in his own favour the discontented crowd. "Oh, Duke of Somerset!" he exclaimed from his seat, "you see yourself brought into the utmost danger, and that nothing but death awaits you. I have once before delivered you from a similar hazard of your life, and I will not now desist from serving you, how little soever you may expect it." Let Somerset appeal to the royal clemency, and Northumberland, forgiving him his offences, would do all in his power to save him. Northumberland's tardy magnanimity fails to carry conviction. But besides his victim's popularity in the country, it was reported that the King took it not in good part, and it was thought well to delay the execution, by which means his supplanter might gain credit for exercising his generosity by an attempt to avert his doom. Christmas was at hand, and it was arranged that the Duke should remain in prison under sentence of death whilst the feast was celebrated at court. In spite of the assertion that the young King had not been unaffected by a tragedy that should have touched him closely, there is nothing in his own words to indicate any other attitude than that of the indifferent spectator. an attitude recalling unpleasantly the callousness shown by his father as the women he had loved and the statesmen he had trusted and employed were successively sent to the block. Though, in justice to Edward, it should be remembered that he had never loved his uncle, there is something revolting in his casual mention of the measures adopted against him. "Little has been done since you went," he wrote to Barnaby Fitzpatrick, the comrade of his childish days, now become his favourite, "but the Duke of Somerset's arraignment for felonious treason, and the muster of the newly erected gendarmerie," and the journal wherein he traces the progress of the trial, varying the narrative by the introduction of other topics, such as the visit of the Queen Dowager of Scotland and the festivities in her honour, conveys a similar impression of coldness. "And so he was adjudged to be hanged," he records in conclusion, noting, with no expression of regret, the result of the proceedings. "It were well that he should die," Edward had told the Duke's brother in those earlier childish days when incited by the Admiral to rebel against the strictness of the discipline enforced by the Protector. But under the mask of indifference it may be that misgivings awoke and made themselves apparent to those who, watching him closely, feared that ties of blood might vindicate their strength, and that at their bidding, or through compassion, he might interpose to avert the fate of one of the only near relations who remained to him. It appears to have been determined that the King's mind must be diverted from the subject, and whilst the prisoner was awaiting in the Tower the execution of his sentence, special merrymakings were arranged by the men who had the direction of affairs at Greenwich, where the court was to keep Christmas. Thus it was hoped to remove the fond talk out of men's mouths, and to recreate and refresh the troubled spirits of the young sovereign. A Lord of Misrule was accordingly appointed, who, dubbed the master of the King's pastimes, took order for the general amusement, though conducting himself more discreetly than had been the wont of his predecessors, and the festival was gaily observed. By these means, says Holinshed, the minds and ears of murmurers were well appeased, till it was thought well to proceed to the business of executing judgment upon the Duke. In whatever light the ghastly contrast between the uncle awaiting a bloody death in the Tower and the noisy merrymaking intended to drown the sound of the passing bell in the nephew's ears may strike students of a later day, it is likely that there was nothing in it to affect painfully those who joined in the proceedings. Life was little considered. Men were daily accustomed to witness violent reverses of fortune. The Duke had aimed over high. He was a danger to rivals whose turn it was to rise. He must make way for others. He had moreover been too deeply injured to forgive, and to make all safe he must die. The reign of the Seymours was at an end. That of Northumberland was beginning. 2 more years, and their supplanter, with Suffolk and his other adherents, would in their turn have paid the penalty of a great ambition, and, with the sons of the Duke of Somerset standing by, would have followed the Lord Protector to the grave. There was none to prophesy their fate. Had it been otherwise, it is not probable that a warning would have turned them from their purpose, for they were reckless gamblers, and to foretell ruin to a man who is staking his all upon a throw of the dice is to speak to deaf ears. So the merry Christmas passed, Jane, third in succession to the throne, occupying a prominent position at court, and Aylmer, fearful lest the fruits of his care should be squandered, looked on helplessly, and besought Bullinger on that 23rd of December to set a limit, for the benefit of a pupil in danger, to the attention lawfully to be bestowed on the world and its vanities. A letter from Haddon, the Duke's chaplain, following fast, and betraying his participation in the anxieties of his colleague by an entreaty that, from afar, the eminent divine would continue to exercise a beneficent influence upon his master's daughter. Meantime, the day had arrived when it was considered safe to carry matters against the king's uncle to extremities, and on January 23, 6 weeks after his trial, the Duke of Somerset was taken to Tower Hill to suffer death in the presence of a vast crowd there assembled. Till the last moment the throng had persisted in hoping against hope that the life of the man they loved might even now, at the 11th hour, be spared, and at one moment it seemed that they were not to be disappointed. The Duke had taken his place upon the scaffold and had begun his speech, when an interruption occurred, occasioned, as it afterwards proved, by an accidental collision between the mass of spectators and a body of troops who had received orders to be present at the execution, and, finding themselves late, had ridden hard and fast to make up for lost time. This was the simple explanation of the occurrence, but to the excited mob gathered together, every nerve strained and full of pity and fear and horror, the sound of the thundering hoofs seemed something supernatural and terrible. Was it a sign of divine interposition? Suddenly, recounts an eyewitness, suddenly came a wondrous fear upon the people, by a great sound which appeared unto many above in the element as it had been the sound of gunpowder set on fire in a close house bursting out, and by another sound upon the ground as it had been the sight of a great number of great horses running on the people to overrun them. So great was the sound of this that the people fell down upon the other, many with bills, and other ran this way, some that way, crying aloud, "Jesus, save us! Jesus, save us!" Many of the people crying, "This way they come, that way they come, away, away!" And I looked where one or other should strike me on the head. So I was stunned. The people, being thus amazed, espies Sir Anthony Browne upon a little nag riding towards the scaffold, and therewith burst out crying in a voice, "Pardon, pardon, pardon," hurling up their caps and cloaks with these words, saying, "God save the King! God save the King!" The good Duke all the while stayed, and with his cap in his hand waited for the people to come together. Whatever had been Sir Anthony's errand, it had not been one of mercy, and when the excitement following upon the panic was calmed, the doomed man and the crowd were alike aware that the people had been misled by hope, and that no pardon had been brought. It is at such a moment that a man's mettle is shown. With admirable dignity Somerset bore the blow. As for a moment he had participated in the expectation of the cheering throng, the colour had flickered over his face. But recovering himself at once, he resumed his interrupted speech. "Beloved friends," he said, "there is no such matter as you vainly hope and believe. Let the people accept the will of God, be quiet as he was quiet, and yield obedience to king and council." A few minutes more and all was over. Somerset, in the words of a chronicler, had taken his death very patiently, with the strange patience in which the victims of injustice scarcely ever failed, the crowd, true to the last to their faith, pressing forward to dip their handkerchiefs in his blood, as in that of a martyr. The laconic entry in the King's Journal, to the effect that the Duke of Somerset had had his head cut off on Tower Hill, presents a sharp contrast to the popular emotion and grief. The deed was, at all events, done. Northumberland had cleared his most formidable competitor from his path, and had no suspicion that the tragedy of that winter's day was in truth paving the way for his own ultimate undoing. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 13, 1552. Northumberland and the King. Edward's illness. Lady Jane and Mary. Mary refused permission to practice her religion. The Emperor intervenes. For the moment master of the field, Northumberland addressed himself sedulously to the task of strengthening and consolidating the position he had won. In the council he had achieved predominance, but the king's minority would not last forever, and the necessity of laying the foundation of a power that should continue when Edward's nominal sovereignty should have become a real one was urgent. The lad was growing up, nor were there wanting moments causing those around him to look on with disquietude to the day when the nobles ruling in his name might be called upon to give an account of their stewardship. A curious anecdote tells how, as Northumberland stood one day watching the king practising the art of archery, the boy put a sharp jest upon him, not without its significance. "Well aimed, my liege," said the Duke merrily, as the arrow hit the white. "But you aimed better," retorted the lad, "when you shot off the head of my uncle Somerset." It was a grim and ominous pleasantry, and in the direct charge it contained of responsibility for the death of Edward's nearest of kin, another shaft besides the arrow may have been sent home. The Tudors were not good at forgiving. Even had the king seen the death of the Duke's rival and victim without regret, it was possible that he would none the less owe a grudge to the man to whom it was due. Nor was Northumberland without a reason for anticipating with uneasiness the day when Edward, remembering all, should hold the reins of government in his own hands. Under these circumstances it was clearly his interest to commend himself to the young sovereign, and the system he pursued with regard to his education and training were carefully adapted to that purpose. Whilst the Protector had had the arrangement of affairs, his nephew had been kept closely to his studies. Northumberland, a soldier at heart and by profession, had him taught to ride and handle his weapons, the boy welcoming the change, and, though not neglecting his books, taking pleasure in every form of bodily exercise, not without occasional pangs of conscience, when more time had been spent in pastime than he thought convenient. "We forget ourselves," he would observe, finding fault with himself sententiously, in royal phrase, upon such occasions, "that should not lose substantia pro accidente." It had been the Protector's custom to place little money at his nephew's disposal, thus rendering him comparatively straitened in the means of exercising the liberality befitting his position, and part of the boy's liking for the Admiral had been owing to the gifts, contrasting with the niggardliness of the elder brother. Profiting by his predecessor's mistakes, Northumberland's was a different policy. He supplied Edward freely with gold, encouraged him to make presents, and to show himself a king, acquainting him besides with public business, and flattering him by asking his opinion upon such matters. The Duke might have spared his pains. It was not by Edward that he was to be called to account. But at that time there were no signs to indicate how futile was the toil of those who were seeking to build their fortunes upon his favour. A well-grown, handsome lad, his health had given no special cause for anxiety up to the spring of 1552. In the March of that year, however, a sharp and complicated attack of illness laid him low, and sowed the seeds of future delicacy. "I fell sick of the smallpox and the measles," recorded the boy in his diary. "April 15th, the Parliament broke up because I was sick and unable to go abroad." To us, who read the laconic entry in the light thrown upon it by future events, it marks the beginning of the end. not only the end of the king's short life, but the beginning of the drama in which many other actors were to be involved and were to meet their doom. As yet, none of the anxious watchers suspected that death had set his broad arrow upon the lad, and in the summer he had so far recovered as to be sending a blithe account to Barnaby Fitzpatrick, then in France, of a progress he had made in the country and its attendant enjoyments. Whilst his old playfellow had been occupied in killing his enemies and sore skirmishing and divers assaults, the king had been killing wild beasts, having pleasant journeys and good fare, viewing fair countries, and seeking rather to fortify his own than to spoil another man's. So he wrote gaily to Fitzpatrick. Meantime his illness, with the dissolution of Parliament consequent upon it, had probably emptied London, the Suffolk family, with others, returning to their country home. In July, Lady Jane was on a visit to her cousin, the Princess Mary, at Newhall, when once more an indiscreet speech, a scoff on this occasion, directed against the outward tokens of that Catholic faith to which Mary was so vehemently loyal, may, repeated to her hostess, have served to irritate her towards the offender against the rules of courtesy and good taste. Under other circumstances it might have been passed over by the older woman with a smile, but subjected to annoyance and petty persecution by reason of her religion, and saddened and embittered by illness and misfortune, the trifling instance of ill manners on the part of a malapert child of 15 may have had its share in accentuating a latent antagonism. In the course of the previous year a controversy had reached its height, which had been more or less imminent since the statute enjoining the use of the new prayer book had been passed, a work said to have afforded the king, then 11 years of age, great comfort and quietness of mind. From that time forward, the decree had become law in 1549, there had been trouble in the royal family, as might be expected when opinion on vital points of religion, the burning question of the day, was widely and violently divergent, and friends and advisers were ever at hand to fan the flame of discord in their own interest or that of their party. No one could be blind to the fact that the ardent Catholicism of the Princess Mary, next in succession to the throne, constituted a standing menace to the future of religion as recently by law established, and to the durability of the work hastily carried through in creating a new church on a new basis. Furthermore, it was considered that her present attitude of open and determined opposition to the decree passed by Parliament was a cause of scandal in the realm. It was certainly one of annoyance to the king and council. Cranmer would probably have liked to keep the peace. An honest man, but no fanatic, and holding moderate views, he might have been inclined, having got what he personally wanted, to adopt a policy of conciliation. Affairs had gone well with him, his friends were in power, and if he failed to inspire the foreign divines and their English disciples with entire trust, it was admitted in 1550 by John Stumpius of that school that things had been put upon a right footing. There is, he added, the greatest hope as to religion, for the Archbishop of Canterbury has lately married a wife. Matters being thus comfortably arranged, Cranmer, if he had had his way, might have preferred to leave them alone. But what could one man do in the interests of peace, when churchmen and laity were alike clamouring for war, when the king's council were against the concession of any one point at issue, and the king himself had composed, before he was 12 years old, an Sans l'aide de personne vivante, a treatise directed against the supremacy of the Pope. To the honour of the king's councillors, few victims had suffered the supreme penalty during his reign on account of their religious opinions. But Gardiner and Bonner as well as Bishops Day and Heath, were in prison, and if the lives of the adherents of the ancient faith were spared, no other mitigation of punishment or indulgence was to be expected by them. Under pressure from the Emperor, the principal offender had been at first granted permission to continue the practice of her religion, but when peace with France rendered a rupture with Charles a less formidable contingency than before, it was decided that renewed efforts should be made to compel the Princess Mary to bow to the fiat of king and council. Love of God and affection for his sister forbade her brother, he declared, to tolerate her obstinacy longer, the intimation being accompanied by an offer of teachers who should instruct her ignorance and refute her errors. Mary was a match for both king and council. In an interview with the lords, she told them that her soul was God's, and that neither would she change her faith nor dissemble her opinions. The council, replying by a chilling intimation that her faith was her own affair, but that she must obey like a subject, not rule like a sovereign. The princess, however, had a card to play unsuspected by her adversaries. The dispute had taken place on August 18. On the 19th, the council was unpleasantly surprised by a strong measure on the part of the imperial ambassador, in the shape of a declaration of war in case his master's cousin was not permitted the exercise of her religion. The council were in a difficulty. War with the emperor, at the moment, and without space for preparation, would have been attended with grave inconvenience. On the other hand, Edward's tender conscience had outrun that of his ministers, and had become so difficult to deal with that all the persuasions of the primate and 2 other bishops were needed to convince the boy, honest and zealous in his intolerance, that to suffer or wink at sin for a time might be borne, so all haste possible was used. A temporizing answer was therefore returned to the imperial ambassador, all haste possible being made in removing English stores from Flanders, so that, in case of a rupture, they might not fall into Charles's hands. This accomplished, fresh and stringent measures were taken to compel the princess's obedience. Her chief chaplain was committed to the Tower, charged with having celebrated Mass in his mistress's house, and 3 of the principal officers of her household were sent to join him there as a punishment for declining to use coercion to prevent a recurrence of the offence. An interview followed between Mary and a deputation of members of the council, who visited her with the object of enforcing the king's orders. The princess received her guests with undisguised impatience, requested them to be brief, and, having listened to what they had to say, answered shortly that she would lay her head upon a block, no idle rhetoric in those days, sooner than use any other form of service than that in use at her father's death. When her brother was of full age, she was ready to obey his commands, but at present, good, sweet king, he could not be a judge in such matters. Her chaplains, for the rest, could do as they pleased in the matter of saying Mass, but none of your new service shall be used in my house, or I will not tarry in it. Thus the controversy practically ended. The council dared not proceed to extremities against the emperor's cousin, and tacitly agreed to let her alone, having supplied her with one more bitter memory to add to the account, which was to be lamentably settled in the near future. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 14, 1552. Lady Jane's Correspondence with Bullinger. Illness of the Duchess of Suffolk. Haddon's difficulties. Ridley's visit to Princess Mary. The English reformers. Edward fatally ill. Lady Jane's character and position. The removal of the two Seymour brothers, whilst it had left Northumberland predominant, had also increased the importance of the Duke of Suffolk, both by reason of the position he personally filled, and owing to his connection through his wife with the King. He was second to none in the state, save the man to whom Somerset's fall was due, and who had succeeded to his power. He shared Northumberland's prominence, as he was afterwards to share his ruin, and as one of the chief props of Protestantism, he and his family continued to be objects of special interest to the divines of that persuasion, foreign and English. Lady Jane, as before, was in communication with the learned Bullinger, and in the same month, July 1552, that her visit had been paid to the Princess Mary, she was sending him another letter, dated from Bradgate, expressing her gratitude for the great friendship he desired to establish between them, and acknowledging his many favours. After a second perusal of his latest letter, since a single one had not contented her, the benefit derived from it had surpassed that to be obtained from the best authors, and in studying Hebrew she meant to pursue the method he recommended. In August, more pressing interests must have taken the place of study, for at Richmond, in Surrey, her mother was attacked by a sickness threatening at one time to prove fatal. "This shall be to advertise you," wrote the Duchess's husband, hastily summoned from London, to Cecil, "that my sudden departing from the court was for that I had received letters of the state my wife was in, who, I assure you, is more liker to die than to live. I never saw a sicker creature in my life than she is. She hath 3 diseases. These 3 being enclosed in one body, it is to be feared that death must needs follow. By your most assured and loving cousin, who, I assure you, is not a little troubled." His anxiety was soon relieved. The Duchess was not only to outlive, but in her haste to replace him, was to show little respect for his memory. She must quickly have got the better of her present threefold disorder, for in the course of the same month a letter was sent from Richmond by James Haddon, the domestic chaplain, to Bullinger, making no mention of any cause of uneasiness as to the physical condition of his master's wife. He was preoccupied by other matters, disquieted by scruples of conscience, and glad to unburthen himself to the universal referee with regard to certain difficulties attending his position in the Duke's household. It was true that he might have hesitated to communicate the fears and misgivings by which he was beset to a guide at so great a distance, had not John ab Ulmus, who, as portrayed by these letters, was somewhat of a busybody, eager to bring all his friends into personal relations, and above all to magnify the authority and importance of his master in spiritual things, just come in and encouraged him to write, stating that it would give Bullinger great satisfaction to be informed of the condition of religion in England, and likewise a more mundane curiosity of that of the Suffolk household. Entering into a description of both, therefore, in a missive containing some 3,000 words, Haddon fully detailed the sorrows and perplexities attending the exercise of the office of chaplain, even in the most orthodox and pious of houses. After dealing with the first and important subject of religion at large, he proceeded to treat of the more complicated question, the condition of the ducal household, and especially the duties attaching to his own post. Of the general regulation of the house, Ulmus, he said, was more capable than he of giving an account. It was rather to be desired that Bullinger should point out the method he would recommend. but upon one point Haddon was anxious to obtain the advice of so eminent a counsellor, and he went on to explain at length the case of conscience by which he had been troubled. This was upon the question of the lawfulness or unlawfulness of conniving by silence at the practice of gambling. The situation was this: the Duke and Duchess had strictly forbidden the members of their household to play at cards or dice for money. So far they had the entire approval of their chaplain. But, and here came in Haddon's cause of perplexity, the Duke himself and his most honourable lady, with their friends, perhaps too their daughter, though there is no mention of her, not only claimed a right to play in their private apartments, but also to play for money. The divergence between precept and practice, common in all ages, was grievous to the chaplain, weighted with the responsibility for the spiritual and moral welfare of the whole establishment, from his patron, the Duke, down to the lowest of the menials. At wearisome and painstaking length he recapitulated the arguments he was wont to employ in his remonstrances against the gambling propensities he deplored, retailing as well the arguments with which the offenders met them. In this manner and to this effect, he says, the dispute is often carried on. During the past months matters had reached a climax. As late as up to the previous Christmas he had confined himself to administering private rebukes, but perceiving that his words had taken no effect, he had forewarned the culprits that a public reprimand would follow a continued disregard of his monitions. Upon this he had been relieved to perceive that there had been for a time a cessation of the reprehensible form of amusement, and had cherished a hope that all would be well. It had been a vain one. Christmas had come round, the season marked by mummeries and wickedness of every kind, when persons especially served the devil in imitation, as it seemed, of the ancient Saturnalia; and though this was happily not the case in the Suffolk family, Duke and Duchess had joined in the general backsliding, to the extent of returning to their old evil habit. Such being the case, Haddon had felt that he had no choice but to carry out his threat. In his Christmas sermon he had taken occasion to administer a reproof as to the general fashion of keeping the feast, including in his rebuke, though in common and general terms, those who played cards for money. No one in the household was at a loss to fix upon the offenders at whom the shaft was directed. The Duke's servants, if they followed his example, took care never to be detected in so doing; and accepting the reprimand as addressed to themselves, the Duke and Duchess took it in bad part, arguing that Haddon would have performed all that duty required of him by a private remonstrance. From that time, offence having been given by his plain speech, the chaplain had returned to his old custom of administering only private rebukes, thus conniving, in a measure, at the practice he condemned, lest loss of influence in matters of greater moment should follow. "I bear with it," he sighed, "as a man who holds a wolf by the ears." Conscience was, however, uneasy, and he begged Bullinger to advise in the matter, and to determine how far such concessions might be lawfully made. Looking impartially at the question, it says much for the Duke's good temper and toleration that the worthy Haddon continued to fill his post, and that when, a few months later, he was promoted to be Dean of Exeter, he wrote that the affection between himself and his master was so strong that the connection would even then not be altogether severed. His attitude is a curious and interesting example of the position and status of a chaplain in his day, being wholly that of a dependent, and yet carrying with it duties and rights strongly asserted on the one side and not disallowed upon the other. The Duchess, having recovered from her illness, had taken her 3 daughters to visit their cousin Mary, and when the younger children were sent home, Jane remained behind at St. John's, Clerkenwell, the London dwelling of the Princess, until her father came to fetch wife and daughter away. That the whole family had been thus entertained indicates that they were, at this time, on a friendly footing with the Princess. But though the Duke of Suffolk was doubtless alive to the necessity of maintaining amicable relations, so far as it was possible, with his wife's cousin and the next heir to the crown, it must have been no easy matter, at a time when party spirit ran so high, for one of the chief recognized supporters of Protestantism to continue on terms of cordiality with the head and hope of the Catholic section of the nation. Mary was not becoming more conciliatory in her bearing as time went on, and an account of a visit paid her by Ridley, now Bishop of London, in place of Bonner, deprived and in prison, is illustrative of her present attitude. It was to Hunsdon that in the month of September Ridley came to pay his respects to the King's sister, cherishing, it may be, a secret hope that where King and Council had failed he might succeed, and his courteous reception by the officers of her household was calculated to encourage his sanguine anticipations. Mary, too, when, at 11 o'clock, he was admitted to her presence, conversed with her guest right pleasantly for a quarter of an hour, telling him that she remembered the time when he had acted as chaplain to her father, and inviting him to stay to dinner. It was not until after the meal was ended that the bishop unfolded the true object of his visit. It was not one of simple courtesy. He had come, he said, to do his duty by her as her diocesan, and to preach before her on the following Sunday. If Mary prepared for battle, she answered at first with quiet dignity. It was observed that she flushed. Her response, however, was merely to bid him make the answer to that himself. When, refusing to take the hint, the bishop continued to urge his point, she spoke more plainly. "I pray you make the answer, as I have said, to this matter yourself," she repeated, "for you know the answer well enough. But if there be no remedy but I must make you answer, this shall be your answer. The door of the parish church adjoining shall be open for you if you come, and you may preach if you list, but neither I nor any of mine shall hear you." To preach to an empty church, or to a handful of country yokels, would not have answered the episcopal purpose, and Ridley was plainly losing his temper. He hoped, he said, she would not refuse to hear God's word. The princess answered with a scoff. She did not know what they now called God's word. She was sure it was not the same as in her father's time, to whom, it will be remembered, the bishop had been chaplain. The dispute was becoming heated. God's word, Ridley retorted, was the same at all times, but had been better understood and practised in some ages than in others. To this Mary replied by a personal thrust. He durst not, she told him, for his ears, have avowed his present faith in King Henry's time. Then, asking a question to which she must have known the answer, "Was he of the council?" she demanded. The inquiry was probably intended as a reminder that his rights did not extend to interference with the King's sister, as well as to elicit, as it did, the confession that he held no such post. "You might well enough, as the council goeth nowadays," observed Mary carelessly, proceeding, at parting, to thank the bishop for his gentleness in coming to see her, "but for your offering to preach before me, I thank you never a whit." In the presence of his hostess, the discomfited guest appears to have kept his temper under control, but having duly drunk of the stirrup cup presented to him by her steward, Sir Thomas Wharton, he gave free expression to his sentiments. "Surely I have done amiss," he said, looking very sadly, and explaining in answer to Wharton's interrogation that he had erred in having drunk under a roof where God's word was rejected. He should rather have shaken the dust off his feet for a testimony against the house, and departed instantly, he told the listeners assembled to speed him on his way, whose hair, says Hylan, in relating this story, stood on end with his denunciations. If scenes of this kind were not adapted to promote good feeling between belligerents in high places, neither was the spirit of the dominant party in the country one to conciliate opposition. It is not easy, as the figures of the English pioneers of Protestantism pass from time to time across the stage, in these years of their first triumph, to do them full justice. To judge a man by one period of his life, whether it is youth or manhood or old age, is scarcely fairer than to pronounce upon the color and pattern of an Eastern carpet, only 1 square yard of it being visible. The adherents of the new faith are here necessarily represented in a single phase, that of prosperity. At the top of the wave they are seen at their worst, assertive, triumphant, intolerant, and self-satisfied, the bulldogs of the Reformation, only withheld by the leash from worrying their fallen antagonist. Thus, for the most part, they appear in Edward's reign. And yet these men, a year or two later, were many of them capable of an undaunted courage, an impassioned belief in the common Lord of Protestant and Catholic, and a power of endurance, which have graven their names upon the national roll call of heroes. Meantime, more and more, the King's precarious health was suggestive of disturbing contingencies. It may be that, as some assert, his uncle's death, once become irrevocable, had preyed upon his spirits, that he mourned, and soon missed the life of his protector, thus unexpectedly taken away, who, now deprived of both uncles, howsoever the time were passed with pastimes, plays and shows, to drive away dumps, yet ever the remembrance of them sat so near his heart that lastly he fell sick. But though it is possible that, as his strength declined, matters he had taken lightly weighed upon his spirits, it is not necessary to seek other than natural and constitutional causes for a failure of health. That failure must have filled many hearts with forebodings. There had been no attempt hitherto to ignore or deny the position occupied by Mary as next heir to the throne. When, at the New Year, she visited her brother, the honours rendered to her were a recognition of her rights, and the Northumberlands and Suffolks occupied a foremost place amongst the vast throng who rode with her through the city or met her at the palace gate, and brought her to the presence chamber of the King. Before the next New Year's Day came round, Edward was to be in his grave. Mary would fill his place, and the little cousin Jane, now spending a gay Christmas with her father's nephews and wards, the young Willoughbys, at Tilsley, would be awaiting her doom in the Tower. The shadow was already darkening over the King. It is said that the seeds of his malady had been sown by overheating in his sports, during the progress of which he had sent so joyous an account to Fitzpatrick. Soon after his sister's visit, he caught a bad cold, and unfavourable symptoms appeared. He had, however, youth in his favour, and few, at first, anticipated how speedy would be the end. Vague disquiet, nevertheless, quickly passed into definite alarm. In February the patient's condition was such that Northumberland, who of all men had most at stake, summoned no less than 6 physicians, desiring them to institute an examination and to declare upon their oath, first, whether they considered the King's disease mortal, and, if so, how long he was likely to live. The reply made by the doctors was that the malady was incurable, and that the patient might live until the following September. Northumberland had obtained his answer. It was for him to take measures accordingly. In March, Edward's last Parliament met and ended. The King being a little diseased by cold-taking, recorded a contemporary chronicle, it was not meet for his Grace to ride to Westminster in the air. And on the 31st, it was Good Friday, the Upper House waited upon him at Whitehall, Edward in his royal robes, receiving the Lords spiritual and temporal. At 7 that evening Parliament was dissolved. Many hearts, loyal and true and pitiful, will have grieved at the signs of their King's decay. but to Northumberland, watching them with the keenness lent by personal interest, personal ambition, and possibly by a consciousness of personal peril, they must have afforded absorbing matter of preoccupation. The exact time at which the designs by which the Duke trusted to turn the boy's death to his advantage rather than to his ruin took definite shape and form must remain to some extent undetermined. His plans were probably decided by the verdict given by the doctors in February. It is certain that in the course of the spring they were elaborated, and that in them Lady Jane Grey, ignorant and unsuspicious, was a factor of primary importance. She was to be the figure-head of the Duke's adventurous vessel. The precise date of her birth is not known, but she was now in her 16th or 17th year, a sorrowful one for her and for all she loved. Childhood was a thing she had left behind. She was touching upon her brief space of womanhood. A few months later, and that too would be over. She would have paid the penalty for the schemes and ambitions of others. The eulogies of her panegyrists have, as a natural effect of extravagant praise, done in some sort of injury to this little white saint of the English Reformation. We do not readily believe in miracles, nor do infant prodigies either in the sphere of morals or attainments attract us. Yet, setting aside the tragedy of her end, there is something that appeals for pity in the very precocity upon which her contemporaries are fond of dwelling, testifying, as it does, to a wasted childhood, to a life robbed of its natural early heritage of carelessness and grace. To have had so short a time to spend on the green earth, and to have squandered so large a portion of it amongst dusty folios and in the acquirement of learning, to have pored over parchments while sun and air, flowers and birds and beasts, all that should make the delight of a child's life, the pageant of a child's spring, was passed by as of no account. Further, to have grown up versed in the technicalities of barren theological debate, the simple facts of Christ's religion overlaid and obscured by the bitterness of professional controversialists, almost every condition of her brief existence is an appeal for compassion, and Jane, from her blood-stained grave, cries out that she had not only been robbed of life by her enemies, but of a childhood by her friends. To a figure defaced by flattery and adulation, whose very virtues and gifts were made to minister to party ends, it is difficult to restore the original brightness and beauty which nevertheless belonged to it. But here and there in the pages of the Italian evangelist, Michael Angelo Florio, who was personally acquainted with her, pictures are to be found which, drawn with tender touches, set the girl more vividly before us than is done by the stilted commendations of English devotees or German doctors of theology. Many times, he says, times when it may be hoped she had forgotten that there were opponents to be argued with, or heretics to be convinced, or doctrinal subtleties to be set forth, she would speak of the Word of God, and almost preach it to those who served her. And Florio himself, recounting the indignities and insults he had suffered by reason of his opinions, had seen her weep with pity, so that he well knew how much she had true religion at heart. Her attendants, too, in days when her melancholy end had caused each trifling incident to be treasured like a relic by those to whom she had been dear, related that she did not esteem rank or wealth or kingdom worth a straw, in comparison with the knowledge God had granted to her of his only Son. It must be remembered that in no long time she was to give proof, by her fashion of meeting death, that these phrases were no repetition of a lesson learned by rote, no empty and conventional form of words, but the true and sincere confession of a living faith. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 15, 1553. The King Dying. Knowles in England. Lady Jane married to Guilford Dudley. Edward's will. Opposition of the law officers. They yield. The King's death. The King was becoming rapidly worse, and as his malady increased upon him, strange suspicions were afloat amongst the people, their hatred to Northumberland giving its colour to their explanation of the situation. He himself, or those upon whom he could count, were ever with the sick boy, and hints were uttered, as was sure to be the case, of poison. For this, murmured the populace, had the King's uncles been removed, his faithful nobles disgraced, and the condition of public opinion caused the Duke, alarmed at its hostility, to publish it abroad that Edward was better. In May, a rally appears to have in fact taken place, giving rise in some quarters to false hopes of recovery. And Mary wrote to offer her congratulations to her brother upon the improvement in his health. On May 13, the new French ambassador, Knowles, whose audience had been deferred from day to day, was informed by the council that their master was so much better that he would doubtless be admitted to the royal presence in the course of a few days. The doctors told a different story, and Knowles believed the doctors. A diplomatist himself, he knew the uses of lying perhaps too well to condemn it severely. That the King was dying was practically certain, and though those whose object it was to conceal the fact, lest measures should be concerted to ensure the succession of the rightful heir, might do their best to disguise the fact, the truth must become known before long. Meantime, the French envoy, in the interest of the reformed party in England, not by reason of their religion, but as opposed to Mary, the Emperor's cousin, was quite willing to play into Northumberland's hands, and to assist him in the work of spreading abroad the report that the King's malady was yielding to treatment. He and his colleagues were accordingly conducted to an apartment near to the presence chamber, where they were left for a certain time alone, in order to convey the impression that they had been personally received by the sovereign. Some days later it was confessed, but as a peril passed, that Edward had been seriously ill. He was then stated to be out of danger, and the ambassadors were admitted to his presence, finding him very weak and coughing much. The rally had been of short duration. Hope of recovery had, in truth, been abandoned, and those it concerned so intimately were forced to face the situation to be created by his death. It was a situation momentous alike to men whose fortunes had been staked upon the young King's life, and to others honestly and sincerely solicitous regarding the welfare of the realm and the consequences to the new religion should his eldest sister succeed to the throne. Every one of the lords of the council and officers of the crown, with almost all the bishops, save those who had suffered captivity and deprivation, had personal reasons for apprehension. Scarcely a single person of influence or power could count upon being otherwise than obnoxious to the heir to the crown. That most of them would be displaced from their posts was to be expected. Some, at least, must have felt that property and life hung in the balance. But it was Northumberland who, as he had most to lose, had most to fear. The practical head of the state, and wielding a power little less than that of Somerset, he had amassed riches and offices to an amount bearing witness to his rapacity. In matters of religion he had been as strong, though less sincere, in his opposition to the Church, claiming Mary's allegiance as his predecessor. During the preceding autumn the iconoclastic work of destruction had been carried on in the metropolitan cathedral. The choir, where the high altar had been accustomed to stand, had been broken down, and the stonework destroyed. Gardiner and Bonner, who, as prominent sufferers for the Catholic cause, would have Mary's ear, were in prison. For all this, Northumberland, with the King's Council as aiders and abettors, was responsible. Not a single claim could be advanced to the liking or toleration of the woman presently to become head of the state. If safety was to be ensured to the advisers of her brother, steps must be taken at once for that purpose. Northumberland and Suffolk set themselves to do so. It was on May 18 that Knowles and his colleagues had been at length permitted to pay their respects to the sick boy. On Whitsunday, the 23rd, the date, though not altogether certain, is probable, 3 marriages were celebrated at Durham House, the London dwelling-place of the Duke of Northumberland. On that day the eldest daughter of the Duke of Suffolk became the wife of Lord Guilford Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland's fourth and, some say, favourite son. Her sister Catherine was bestowed upon Lord Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke's heir, to be repudiated by him the following year, and Lady Catherine Dudley, Northumberland's daughter, was married to Lord Hastings. The object of the threefold ceremony was clear. The main cause of it, and of the haste shown in carrying it through, was a dying boy, whose life was flickering out a few miles distant at Greenwich. It behoved his 2 most powerful subjects, Northumberland and Suffolk, to strengthen their position as speedily as might be, and by this means it was hoped to accomplish that object. The place chosen for the celebration of the weddings might have served, perhaps it did, to host and guests, as a reminder of the perils of those who climb too high. Durham House, appropriated in his days of prosperity by Somerset, to the indignation of Elizabeth, who laid claim to the property, had been forfeited to the crown upon his attainder, and was the dwelling of his more fortunate rival. And, as if to drive the lesson further home, the very cloth of gold and silver, lent from the royal coffers to deck the bridal party, had been likewise drawn from the possessions of the ill-starred Duke. The dead furnished forth the festal array of the living. That day, with its splendid ceremonial, the marriages took place with much magnificence in the presence of a great assembly, including the principal personages of the realm, presents a grim and striking contrast to what was to follow. None were present, so far as we know, with the eyes of a seer, to discern the thin red ring foretelling the proximate fate of the girl who played the most prominent part in it, or to recognize in death the presiding genius of the pageant. Yet the destiny said in old days to dog the steps of those doomed to a violent death, and to be present at their side from the cradle to the grave, must have stood by many, besides the bride, who joined in the proceedings on that Whitsunday. Where would Northumberland be that day year, or Suffolk, or young Guilford Dudley, or a little later the bishop who tied the knots? How Jane played her part we can only guess, or what she had thought of the arrangement, hurriedly concluded, by which her future was handed over to the keeping of her boy husband. Whether willing or unwilling, she had no choice but to obey, to accept the bridegroom chosen for her, a tall, handsome lad of 17 or 19, it is not clear which, and to make the best of it. Rosso, indeed, deriving his information from Michel, Venetian ambassador in London, and Bodoaro, Venetian ambassador to Charles V, states that after much resistance, urged by her mother and beaten by her father, she had consented to their wishes. It may have been true, and standing at the altar, her thoughts may have wandered from the brilliant scene around her to the room at Greenwich, where the husband proposed to her in earlier days was dying. She might have been Edward's wife had he lived. She can scarcely have failed to have been aware of the hopes and designs of her father, of those of the dead admiral, and of others. She had, in a measure, been brought up in the expectation of filling a throne. But the plan was forgotten now. Edward was to be the husband, neither of Jane nor of that other cousin, not of royal blood, the daughter of his sometime protector, whose father was dead and mother in the Tower, nor yet of the foreign bride, well stuffed and jewelled, of whom he had himself bragged. He was dying, like any other boy of no royal race, upon whose life no momentous issues hung. From his sick bed he had taken a keen interest in what was going forward, appearing, says Heylin, as forward in the marriages as if he had been one of the principals in the plot against him. He might be fond of Jane, but even had he loved her, which there is nothing to show, he was too far within the shadow of the grave to feel any jealousy in seeing her handed over to another bridegroom. At the demeanour of the little victim of the Whitsun sacrifice we can but guess. Grave and serious we picture her, as it was her wont to be, with the steadfast face depicted by the painters of the day, far, in spite of Seymour's boast, from being as handsome as any lady in England, but with a purity and simplicity, a stillness and repose, restful to those who looked into the quiet eyes and marked the tranquillity of the countenance. Did she, in her inward cogitations, divine that there was danger ahead? If so, we can fancy she was ready to face it. Were it God's will, then let it come. Peril was the anteroom, death the portal of the eternal city, the heavenly Jerusalem in which she believed. Such was the image printed upon the time by the woman-child who was never to know maturity, as it lived in the tender and loving remembrance of her contemporaries, the delicately sculptured figure of a saint in the temples of the iconoclasts. By the country at large the sudden marriages were regarded with suspicion. The noise of these marriages bred such amazement in the hearts of the common people, apt enough in themselves to speak the worst of Northumberland, that there was nothing left unsaid which might serve to show their hatred against him, or express their pity for the king. Overbearing and despotic, the merciless Bear of Warwick, as he was nicknamed, was so detested that by some the failure of his scheme was afterwards ascribed rather to his unpopularity than to love for Mary. Yet it was Northumberland who, with the blindness born of a sanguine ambition, was to trust, 6 weeks later, to the populace to join with him in dispossessing the king's sister, for whom they had always shown affection, and in placing his daughter-in-law and her boy husband upon the throne. So glaring a misapprehension of the situation demands explanation, and it is partly supplied by a French appreciation of the Duke's character. According to Monsieur Griffet, he was more heedful to conceal his own sentiments than capable of discerning those of others, a man of ambition who neither knew whom to trust nor whom to suspect, who, blinded by presumption, was therefore easily deceived, and who nevertheless believed himself to possess to the highest degree the gift of deceiving all the world. Such as he was, he had deceived himself to his undoing. Meantime, Lady Jane's marriage had made for the moment little change in her manner of life. She had answered the purpose for which she was required, and was permitted temporarily to retire behind the scenes. It is said, and there is nothing unlikely in the assertion, that the ceremony over, and obedience having been rendered to her parents' behest, she entreated that she might continue with her mother for the present. She and her new husband were so young, she pleaded. Her request was granted. She was Guilford Dudley's wife, could be the wife of no other man, and that was, for the moment, sufficient. There was much to think of, much to do. Measures had to be taken to keep the king's sisters at a distance, lest his old affection for Elizabeth in particular, reawakening, might frustrate the designs of those bent upon moulding events to their advantage. Above all, there was the pressing necessity of inducing the king to exclude them by will from their rightful heritage. On June 16, Noailles had again been conferring with the doctors, and had learnt that, in their opinion, Edward could not live till August. 10 days later Northumberland came from Greenwich to visit the envoy, and to prevent his going to court. He then told the Frenchman that 9 days earlier the king had executed his will in favour of the Duke's daughter-in-law, Lady Jane. "Qui est vertueuse, sage et belle," reported the envoy to his master some 3 weeks later. Of the manner in which the will had been obtained, full information is available. It was not out of love for Northumberland that Edward had yielded to his representations. The Throckmorton manuscript asserts that Edward abhorred the Duke on account of his uncle's death. Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, in attendance on the king, should be a good authority. On the other hand, he was opposed to the Duke's designs. Whether or not the latter was personally distasteful to the boy, it was no difficult matter to represent the situation in a fashion to lead him to believe the sole alternative was the course suggested to him. Conscientious, pious, scrupulous to a fault, and worn by disease, the future of religion could be made to hang upon his fiat, and the thought of Mary, a devout Catholic, or even Elizabeth, who might marry a foreign prince seated upon the throne, filled him with apprehensions for the welfare of a people for whom he felt himself responsible. Yet he, with little to love, had loved both his sisters, and the thought of the sick lad, torn between duty and affection, a tool in the hands of unprincipled and ambitious men who could play on his sensitive conscience and overstrained nerves at will, and turn his piety to their advantage, is a painful one. The Duke's arguments lay ready to his hand. Religion was in danger, the Church set up by Edward in jeopardy. The work that he had done might be destroyed as soon as he was in the grave. How could he answer it before God were he, who was able to avert it, to permit so great an evil? The remedy was clear. Let him pass over his sisters, already pronounced severally illegitimate by unrepealed statutes of Parliament, and entail the crown upon those who, under his father's will, would follow upon Mary and Elizabeth, the descendants of Mary Tudor, known to be firm in their attachment to the Reformed faith. Edward yielded. Given the circumstances, the power exercised by the Duke over him, his physical condition, his fears for religion, he could scarcely have done less. With his own hand he drew up the draft of a will which, amended at Northumberland's bidding, left the crown in unmistakable terms to Lady Jane and her heirs male. It had now to be made law and accepted by the Council. On June 11, Sir Edward Montagu, Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, Sir Thomas Bromley, another Justice of the same court, Sir Richard Baker, Chancellor of the Augmentations, and the Attorney and Solicitor General were called to Greenwich, and were introduced into the King's apartment, Northampton, Gates, and others being present at the interview. If what took place on this occasion, and at the other audiences of the legal officers with the King, as recorded by themselves, is naturally, as Dr. Lingard has pointed out, represented in such a manner as to extenuate their conduct in Mary's eyes, there seems no reason to doubt that Montagu's account is substantially true. In his sickness, Edward told them he had considered the state of the realm, and of the succession, should he die without leaving direct heirs, and proceeding to point out the danger to religion and to liberty should his sister Mary succeed to the throne, he ordered them to make a book with speed of his articles. The lawyers demurred, but the King, feverishly eager to put an end to the business, and conscious perhaps that if the thing were not done quickly it might not be done at all, refused to listen to the objections they would have urged, dismissing them with orders to carry out his pleasure with haste. For all his gentleness and piety, Edward was a Tudor, and no less peremptory than others of his race. 2 days later, it was June 14, having deliberated on the question, The men of law acquainted the council with their decision. The thing could not be done. To make or execute the device according to the king's instructions would be treason. The report was made to Sir William Petre at Ely Place, but the Duke of Northumberland was at hand, and came thereupon into the council chamber, being in a great rage and fury, trembling for anger, and amongst all his rageous talk called Sir Edward Montague traitor, and further said he would fight any man in his shirt in that quarrel. It was plain that no technical or legal obstacles were to be permitted to turn him from his purpose. The following day the law officers were again called to Greenwich. Conveyed in the first place to a chamber behind the dining room, they met with a chilling reception. All the lords looked upon them with earnest countenances, as though they had not known them, and, brought into the king's presence, Edward demanded, with sharp words and angry countenance, why his book was not made. Montague, as spokesman for his colleagues, explained. Had the king's device been executed, it would become void at the king's death, the statute of succession passed by Parliament being still in force. A statute could be altered by statute alone. On Edward's replying that Parliament should then shortly be called together, Montague caught at the solution. The matter could be referred to it, and all peril saved. But this was not the king's meaning. The deed, he explained, was to be executed at once, and was to be afterwards ratified by Parliament. With growing excitement, he commanded the officers, very sharply, to do his bidding. Some of the lords, standing behind the king, adding that, did they refuse, they were traitors. The epithet was freely bandied about in those days, yet it never failed to carry a menace, and Montague, in as great fear as ever he was in all his life before, seeing the king so earnest and sharp, and the duke so angry the day before, and being an old weak man and without comfort, began to look about for a method of satisfying king and council without endangering his personal safety. In the end he gave way, consenting to prepare the required papers on condition that he might first be given a commission under the Great Seal to draw up the instrument, and likewise a pardon for having done so. Northumberland had won the day. It was afterwards reported that when the will was signed a great tempest arose, with a whirlwind such had never been seen, the sky dark and fearful, lightning and infinite thunder, one of the thunderbolts accompanying that terrible storm falling upon the miserable church where heresy was first begotten. This accident was observed by many persons of sense and prudence, and was considered a great sign of the avenging justice of God. The council, undeterred by the manifestations of divine wrath, were not backward in endorsing the deed. Overborne by the Duke, probably also influenced by the apprehension of a compulsory restoration of church spoils should Mary succeed, they unanimously acquiesced in the act of injustice. To a second paper, designed by the Duke to commit his colleagues further, 24 councillors and legal advisers set their hands. By June 21, the official instrument had received the signatures of the Lords of the Council, other peers, judges, and officers of the Crown, to the number of 101. The princesses had been set aside, and the fatal heritage, so far as it was possible, secured to Lady Jane. The King, at the direction of her nearest of kin, had in effect affixed his signature to her death sentence. When Northumberland was assured of success, he gave a magnificent musical entertainment, to which the French ambassador was bidden. 3 days earlier it had been reported to Knowles that Edward was at the point of death, and he was surprised at the merrymaking and the good spirits prevalent. The affair, it was explained to him, was in honour of the convalescence of the King, who had been without fever for 2 days, and whose recovery appeared certain. The envoy doubtless expressed no incredulity, and congratulated the company upon the good tidings. He knew that Edward was moribund, and understood that the rejoicings were in truth to celebrate the approaching elevation to the throne of Northumberland's daughter-in-law. Was she present? We cannot tell, but it was the Duke's policy to make her a prominent figure, and Noailles' description of her beauty and goodness implies a personal acquaintance. It only remained for Edward to die. All those around him, with perhaps some few exceptions amongst his personal attendants, were eagerly awaiting the end. All had been accomplished that was possible whilst he was yet alive, and Northumberland and his friends were probably impatient to be up and doing. His sisters were at a distance, his uncles dead, Barnaby Fitzpatrick was abroad, and he was practically alone with the men who had made him their tool. The last scene is full of pathos. 3 hours before the end, lying with his eyes shut, he was heard praying for the country which had been his charge. "O God," he entreated, "deliver me out of this miserable and wretched life, and take me among thy chosen. Howbeit not my will, but thine be done. Lord, I commend my spirit to thee. O Lord, thou knowest how happy it were for me to be with thee. Yet for thy chosen's sake send me life and health, that I may truly serve thee. O my Lord God, bless thy people, and save thine inheritance. O Lord God, save thy chosen people of England. O Lord God, defend this realm from papistry, and maintain thy true religion, that I and my people may praise thy holy name, for Jesus Christ his sake." Then turned he his face, and seeing who was by him, said to them, "Are ye so nigh? I thought ye had been further off." Then Dr. Owens said, "We heard you speak to yourself, but what you said we know not." He then, after his fashion, smilingly said, "I was praying to God." The end was near. "I am faint," he said. "Lord, have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." And so on July 7, towards night, he passed away. On the following day, Noailles communicated to his court, "Le triste et piteux inconvénient de la mort" of Edward VI, last of the Tudor kings. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Lady Jane Grey and Her Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines, Salt Lake City, Utah. Lady Jane Grey and Her Times by Ida Ashworth Taylor. Chapter 16, 1553. After King Edward's death. Results to Lady Jane Grey. Northumberland's schemes. Mary's escape. Scene at Sion House. Lady Jane brought to the Tower. Quarrel with her husband. Her proclamation as Queen. A boy was dead. A frail little life, long failing, had gone out. That was all. Nevertheless, upon it had hung the destinies of England. Speculations and forecasts as to the consequences, had Edward lived, are unprofitable. Yet one wonders what, grown to manhood, he would have become, whether the gentle lad, pious, studious, religious, the modern Josiah, as he was often called, would have developed, as he grew to maturity, the dangerous characteristics of his Tudor race, the fierceness and violence of his father, the melancholy and relentless fanaticism of Mary, the absence of principle and sensuality of Elizabeth. Or would he have fulfilled the many hopes which had found their centre in him, and have justified the love of his subjects, given him upon credit? It is impossible to say. What was certain was that his part was played out, and that others were to take his place. Amongst these, his little cousin Jane was at once the most innocent and the most unfortunate. Hitherto she had looked on as a spectator at life, her skiff moored in a creek of the great river, She had watched from a place of comparative calm the stream as it rushed by. Here and there a wave might make itself felt even in that quiet place. A wreck might be carried past, or she might catch the drowning cry of a swimmer as he sank. But to the young such things are accidents from participation in which they tacitly consider themselves exempted, regarding them with the fearlessness due to inexperience. Suddenly all was to be changed. Torn from her anchorage, she was to be violently borne along by the torrent towards the inevitable catastrophe. As yet she was ignorant of the destiny prepared for her. Under her father's roof she had pursued her customary occupations, and by some authorities her third extant letter to Bullinger, another tribute of admiration and flattery, and containing no allusion to current events, is believed to belong to the interval occurring between her marriage and the King's death. The allusion to herself as an untaught virgin, and the signature Jane Grey, seemed to give it a date earlier in the year. The time was fast approaching when leisure for literary exercises of the kind would be lacking. It would have been difficult to trace her movements precisely at this juncture, were it not that she has left a record of them in a document, either directly addressed to Mary from her prison or intended for her eyes, in which she demonstrated her innocence. Notwithstanding the promise made by the Duchess of Northumberland at her marriage, that she should be permitted to remain at home, she appears to have been by this time living with her husband's parents, and upon Edward's death becoming imminent, she was informed of the fact by her father-in-law, who forbade her to leave his house, adding the startling announcement that, when it should please God to call the King to his mercy, she would at once repair to the Tower, her cousin having nominated her heir to the throne. The news found her totally unprepared, and, shocked and partly incredulous, she refused obedience to the Duke's commands, continuing to visit her mother daily, in spite of the indignation of the Duchess of Northumberland, who grew wroth with me and with her, saying that she was determined to keep me in her house, that she would likewise keep my husband there, to whom I should go later in any case, and that she would be under small obligation to me. Therefore it did not seem to me lawful to disobey her, and for 3 or 4 days I stayed in her house, until I obtained permission to resort to the Duke of Northumberland's palace at Chelsea. At this place, the reason of her preference for it is not given, she continued, sick and anxious, until a summons reached her to go to Sion House, there to receive a message from the King. It was Lady Sydney, a married daughter of the Duke's, who brought the order, saying, with more gravity than usual, that it was necessary that her sister-in-law should obey it, and Lady Jane did not refuse to do so. Sion House, where the opening scene of the drama took place, was another of the possessions of the Duke of Somerset, passed into the hands of his rival. A monastery, founded by Henry V at Isleworth, it had been seized, with other church property, in 1539, and had served 2 years later as a prison to the unhappy child Catherine Howard. The place had been acquired by Somerset in the days of his power, when the building of the great house, which was to replace the convent, was begun. The gardens were enclosed by high walls, a triangular terrace in one of their angles, alone allowing the inmates to obtain a view of the country beyond. In 1552 it had, with most of the late Protector's goods and chattels, been confiscated, and during the following year, the year of the King's death, it had been granted to Northumberland. It was to this place that Lady Jane was taken to receive the message said to be awaiting her from the King. Her destination reached, Sion House was found empty, but it was not long before those who were pulling the strings arrived. The message from the King had been a fiction. Edward's gentle spirit was at rest, and he himself forgotten in the rush of events. There was little time for thought of the dead. the interests of religion and of the state, as some would call it, the ambition of unscrupulous and unprincipled men, as it would be named by others, demanded the whole attention of the steersman, who stood, for the moment, at the helm. It had been decided to keep the fact of the king's death secret until measures should have been taken to ensure the success of the desperate game they were playing. To secure possession of the person of his natural successor was of the first importance, and a letter had been dispatched to Mary when her brother was manifestly at the point of death, which it was hoped would avail to bring her to London, and would enable her enemies to fulfil their purpose. Stating that the king was very ill, she was entreated to come to him, as he earnestly desired the comfort of her presence. Mary must have been well aware of the risk she would run in responding to the appeal, and it says much for her courage and her affection that she did not hesitate to incur it. A fortunate chance, however, frustrated the designs against her. Starting from Hunsdon, where the tidings had found her, she had reached Hoddesdon on her way to Greenwich, when she was met by intelligence that determined her to go no further. The king was dead. Nor was it difficult to discern in the urgent summons, sent too late to accomplish its ostensible purpose, a transparent attempt to induce her to place herself in the power of her enemies. Opinions have differed as to the means by which Northumberland's scheme was frustrated. Some say that the news was conveyed to the princess by the Earl of Arundel. Sir Thomas Throckmorton also claims credit for the warning. According to this account of the matter, a young brother of his, in attendance upon Northumberland, had become cognizant of the intended treachery, and had come post haste to report what was afoot at his father's house. A few words spoken by Sir John Gates, visiting the Duke before he had risen, were all that had reached the young man's ears. But those words had been of startling significance, the state of affairs being what it was. "What, sir," he had heard Gates say, "will you let the Lady Mary escape, and not secure her person?" A consultation was hurriedly held at Throckmorton House between the father and his three sons. Sir Nicholas, who had been present at the king's death, was too well aware of the circumstances to minimize the importance of his brother's story, and summoning the Princess Mary's goldsmith, it was decided to entrust him with the duty of conveying a caution to his mistress, and stopping her journey. Sir Nicholas's metrical version of what followed may be given. "Morning, from Greenwich did I straight depart, to London, to a house which bore our name. My brethren guessed by my heavy heart the king was dead, and I confessed the same. The hushing of his death I did unfold, their meaning to proclaim Queen Jane I told. Wherefore from 4 of us the news was sent, how that her brother he was dead and gone. In post her goldsmith then from London went, by whom the message was dispatched anon. She asked if we knew it, certainly, who said Sir Nicholas knew it verily." The first stroke hazarded by the conspirators had resulted in failure. Mary, after some deliberation, turned her face northwards, and escaped the snare laid for her by her enemies. The next object of Northumberland and his friends was to obtain the concurrence of the city to the substitution of his daughter-in-law for the rightful heir. Various as were the views of the best means of ensuring success, all the council were agreed on one point, namely, that London was the hand which must reach Jane the crown. London was to be made to do it. On July 8 the Lord Mayor, with 6 aldermen, 6 merchants of the staple, and as many merchant adventurers, were summoned to Greenwich, were there secretly informed of the king's death, and of his will by letters patent, to which they were sworn and charged to keep it secret. All this had been done before Lady Jane was summoned to Sion House. It was time for the stage queen to make her appearance, and at Sion the facts were made known to her. Of her reception of the great news accounts vary. A graphic picture, painted in the first place by Heylin, has been copied by divers other historians. The learned John Nichols, unable to trace it in any contemporary documents or records, has decided that it must be classed amongst those dramatic scenes in which historical writers formerly considered themselves justified in indulging. He is probably right. Yet an early and generally accepted tradition has a value of its own, and may be true to the spirit, if not to the letter, of what actually occurred. Mary herself afterwards told the envoy of Charles V that she believed her cousin to have had no part in the Duke of Northumberland's enterprise, and supposing her to have been ignorant, or only dimly cognizant of the plot, the revelation of it may easily have occasioned her a shock. It has been constantly asserted that, in this first interview with those who, calling themselves her subjects, were practically the masters of her fate, she began by declining to be a party to their scheme; and if her letter, written at a later date, from the Tower, to Mary, does not wholly confirm the assertion, it points to an attitude of reluctant assent. Her mother-in-law had given her hints of what was intended, but, like the announcement made by the Duke at Durham House of her approaching greatness, they were too incredible to be taken seriously, and the fact that when she was joined at Sion by the Dukes of Northumberland and Suffolk, they did not at once make the matter plain, but confined the conversation for a time to indifferent subjects, seems to indicate a doubt upon their part of her pliability. There was, nevertheless, a change in their demeanour and bearing, giving rise in her mind to an uneasy consciousness of a mystery she had not fathomed, whilst Huntingdon and Pembroke, who were present, treated her with even more incomprehensible reverence, and went so far as to bow the knee. On the arrival of her mother, together with the Duchess of Northumberland, the explanation of the riddle took place. The tidings of the King's death and of her exaltation was broken to her, together with the reasons prompting Edward to set aside his sisters in her favour. The nobles fell upon their knees, took her formally for their queen, and swore, it was shortly to be proved how little the oath was worth, to shed their blood in defence of her rights. Having heard such things, pursues Lady Jane in her apology, with infinite grief of spirit, I call to witness those lords who were present, that I was so stunned and stupefied that, overcome by sudden and unexpected sorrow, they saw me fall to the ground, weeping very bitterly, and afterwards, declaring to them my insufficiency, I lamented much the death of so noble a prince, and at the same time turned to God, humbly praying and beseeching him that, if what was given me was in truth and legitimately mine, he would grant me grace and power to govern to his glory and service, and for the good of this realm. There is, as Dr. Lingard points out, nothing unnatural in this description of what had occurred, whereas the grandiloquent language attributed to her by some historians is most unlikely to have been used at a moment both of grief and excitement. According to these authorities, not only did she defend Mary's right and denounce those who had conspired against it, but delivered a lengthy oration upon the fickleness of fortune. If she enrich any, it is but to make them the subject of her sport. If she raise others, it is but to pleasure herself with their ruins. What she adored yesterday, today is her pastime. And if I now permit her to adorn and crown me, I must tomorrow suffer her to crush and tear me to pieces. Proceeding to cite Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn as examples of those who had, to their own undoing, worn a crown. If you love me sincerely and in good earnest, she is made to say, you will rather wish me a secure and quiet fortune, though mean, than an exalted condition exposed to the wind, and followed by some dismal fall. Poor little plaything of the fortune she is represented as anathematizing, the designs of those who were striving to exalt her were due to nothing less than a sincere love. Any other puppet would have answered their purpose equally well, so that the excuse of royal blood was in her veins. But Jane, willing or unwilling, was to be made use of for their ends, and it was vain for her to protest. On the following day, July 10, the Queen designate was brought, following the ancient custom of kings on their accession, to the Tower, reaching it at 3 o'clock, to be received at the gate by Northumberland, and formally presented with the keys in the presence of a great crowd who looked on at the proceedings in sinister silence, and gave no sign of rejoicing or cordiality. Shortly after, the Marquis of Winchester, in his capacity of treasurer, brought the crown jewels, with the crown itself, asking me, wrote Jane, to put it on my head, to try whether it fitted me or not. Who knows well that, with many excuses, I refused. He not the less insisted that I should boldly take it, and that another should be made, that my husband might be crowned with me, which I certainly heard unwillingly and with infinite grief and displeasure. The idea that young Guilford Dudley, with no royal blood to make his claim colourable, was intended to share her dignity, appears to have roused his wife, somewhat strangely, to hot indignation. She at least was a Tudor on her mother's side, but what was Dudley, that he should aspire so high? Had she loved her boy husband, she might have taken a different view of his pretensions, but there is nothing to show that she regarded him with any special affection, and she was disposed to use her authority after a fashion neither he nor his father would tolerate. At first Guilford, taken by surprise, appeared inclined to yield the point, and in a conversation between the two, when Winchester had withdrawn, he agreed that, were he to be made king, it should only be by Act of Parliament. Thereupon, losing no time in setting the matter on a right footing, Jane sent for the Earls of Arundel and Pembroke, and informed them that if she were to be queen, she would be willing to make her husband duke, but to make him king I would not consent. Though Arundel and Pembroke were probably quite at one with her on the question, that she should show signs of exercising an independent judgment was naturally exasperating to those to whom it was due that she was placed in her present position, and when the Duchess of Northumberland became aware of what was going forward, she not only treated Lady Jane, according to her own account, very ill, but stirred up Guilford to do the like. The boy, primed by his mother, declaring that he would in no wise be duke, but king, and holding sulkily aloof from his wife that night, so that she was compelled, as a woman and loving my husband, to send the Earls of Arundel and Pembroke to bring him to her, otherwise he would have left in the morning, at his mother's bidding, for Sion. Thus, ends the poor child, I was in truth deceived by the Duke and Council, and badly treated by my husband and his mother. The discussion was premature. Boy and girl were all too soon to learn that it was not to be a question of crowns for either, so much as of heads to wear them. Whilst the wrangle had been carried on in the Tower, the first step had been taken towards bringing the disputants to the scaffold. The death of the king had been made public, together with the provisions of his will, and Jane had been proclaimed queen in 2 or 3 parts of the city. The 10th day of the same month, runs the entry in the Grey Friars Chronicle, after 7 o'clock at night, was made a proclamation in Cheap by 3 heralds and 1 trumpet, for Jane, the Duke of Suffolk's daughter, to be Queen of England, but few or none said, God save her. There was a singular unanimity upon the subject amongst the citizens of London. It is said that upon the faces of the heralds, forced to proclaim the new queen, their discontent was visible, and a curious French letter sent from London at the time states, after mentioning the absence of any acclamation upon the part of the people, that a moment afterwards they had broken out into lamentation, clamour, tears, sighs, sadness, and desolation impossible to describe. Thus inauspiciously was Lady Jane's 9 days' reign inaugurated. On a great catafalque in Westminster Abbey the dead boy king was lying, guarded each day and night by 12 watchers until he should be given sepulture. But there was little leisure to attend to his obsequies on the part of the men who had made him their tool, and had staked their lives and fortunes upon the success of their plot. For the present all had gone according to their hopes. Through the pious intents of Edward, the religion of Mary, the ambition of Northumberland, the simplicity of Suffolk, the fearlessness of the judges, and the flattery of the courtiers. Thus Fuller sums up the causes to which the situation was due. Matters were made as sure as man's policy can make that good which in itself is bad. It was quickly to be seen to what that security amounted. End of chapter 16.